we got to get moving. I got 700 years to cover, and the snow keeps getting me in my way here. Let me know if I go too fast, or there are too many gaps in what you're hearing, or you're falling asleep or not paying attention. But concentrate. Above all, concentrate on the chronology. I love dates. You know, we've had a lot of dates, but really, it's the dates that start now that are really critical. Up until now, you've had the time, the arrival of, the pre-Christian time would have been the book of Daniel, or when the Jews finally came out of exile 500 years before Christ, and then the writing down of the Torah, and then the arrival of the Greeks and the Romans before the appearance of Jesus. But the Messianic period, you want to get a handle on when these things were happening, and then we start moving forward. For 300 years, the Romans are eating the Christian in the lions, and then Constantine comes, and in the 4th century, Christianity gets its armies. The Jews are driven out of the Holy Land. They're wandering all over the place. The next big calendar date is in the 6th and 7th century when Islam is born, and then Islam rapid and more rapidly really than Christianity, spreads out of the Arabian Peninsula, spreads eastward to India, westward north, across North Africa, and then the biggest date of all, up until now, 711 AD. What happens in 711 AD? The Moorish, Berber, Arab, Islamic armies cross the Straits of Gibraltar, and now we get everybody in Europe. The Christians are there. The Jews are just drifting along with anybody that'll leave them alone. They go along with the Berber, Moorish, Arab armies. Why do I mention Berber, Moorish, and Arab separately? They're all Muslim, but they are all ethnically different. They're different. The Arabs are the Arabs. The Moors are the Moors. Who's the most important Moor in history that you know? Othello. Very good. Othello is a Moor. And then you got the Berbers, who are another bunch of North African tribes that are not related to either. So you got 3 separate groups. They're all Muslim. They all cross the Straits of Gibraltar. They all conquer the Iberian Peninsula. They all cross the Pyrenees, get in just south of Paris at the Battle of Tours. They're stopped, come back across the Pyrenees, and we have the golden age of Islam for 500, 600, 700 years. We had that. Christianity is learning from Islam. Judaism is learning from Islam. But in the year 1000, that sense of millennialism strikes Christianity big time, and they begin to push back. The major manifestation of that pushback occurs at the end of the 11th century in 1095, when Pope Urban II says, I know why Christ hasn't returned. It's because the infidel occupies the Holy Land. And he begins the first of 9, where's my pen? Crusades. And the period of the Crusades begins. Urban II, 1095 to 1291. 9 Crusades. By the end of that, they bring something new to the relationship between these 3 religions. First of all, now they're all in Europe, and they're going to march through Europe on their way, or at least Christianity is now leaving Europe, but marching through Europe on its way to, what are the destinations of all 9 Crusades? Jerusalem. Take Jerusalem back and prepare the way for Christ's return. Well, these 9 Crusades were bloody on the way. They killed. The threat, Islam was a bigger threat than Judaism. First of all, in Islam, remember, who was the Islamic Messiah? No, not the Messiah. Who was somebody said Abraham. Very nice answer, but not the right one. Who was the Islamic Messiah? Jesus. So Islam did not do to Jesus what Judaism did. What did Judaism do with the figure of Jesus? It denied his role. It denied that he was the Messiah, and then later on, it took 4 centuries for Jesus to not only become the human Messiah, he became Son, Father, and Holy Spirit. Jesus became God. That was a metamorphosis that took place from the Jewish Bible, from the earliest Christian Jews, and the Jewish Christians were gone from Christian theology. The writers from the 3rd century, 4th century on, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, St. Christopher, the Christian writers, the early Christian fathers, they were the ones who took from the book of John and separated the Jewish Jesus and really erased the Jewish Jesus. Now you're left with the Jews as the deniers, Islam as saying, no, Jesus is the Messiah, he's just 100% human. So Islam denies the divinity of Jesus. What Christianity evolved into was taking the figure of Jesus and making him God. That's how the three religions evolved. The furthest away from Christianity was what? Was which of? The furthest away was Judaism, because what did Judaism do? It refused to acknowledge and accept. So Judaism was the denier. And that stayed okay for 5 or 6 or 7 or 800 years, but eventually, when the Crusades came something else. Now begins Christian pushback, and in the 11th century it starts. The Crusades identifies the Jews and Islam as the infidels. They're no longer the people of the book, no longer any relationship to one another. The Jews and the Muslims become infidels. The Jews are harmless, so you can really beat up on them. The Muslims you got to be careful with because they got armies. They got guns, they got armies, they got, no guns yet, but they got weapons and they got millions already, hundreds of thousands getting on to millions. So Islam is more dangerous. But the Jews are necessary. And St. Augustine in the 4th century said, we must keep the Jews around. Why? Anybody study early Christian theology? Anybody study anything about St. Augustine? What did Augustine say? He says, we must keep the Jews around to be witness. So stop killing them, stop abusing them. Well, you can abuse them, just don't kill them. Let them stick around so that when the time comes, and that time surely will come, what will they be around to say? Jesus is our Messiah. Jesus is our God. So that's why the Christianity in the early church fathers, after Constantine and into the 4th, 5th, 6th century, said, leave the Jews alone because we need them eventually to bear witness. That's not that far from where we are now in the 21st century and Christian evangelicalism, which is very, very, very supportive of Jewish orthodoxy, because they want the Jews to be around when, after the millennium is over and the struggle with the Antichrist is over, the Jews will then be here to accept the witness of Christ's triumph in the world. So the Jews always play a role. That's in theology. The masses don't go for it often. They just get angry and they go and burn them in their cathedrals and do whatever they do. But Islam was the dangerous one, and they got pushed out of Europe completely. The Jews were given a new role. That Jewish role. So the church militant, now we have a new kind of church. It's the church militant that we started here last time. The infidels as outcasts. The Crusades were a bloodbath. It changed the whole thing. The Crusades were the single most important event of conflict among these three religions. The Crusades to today, that's the 1,000 years that you can say, or the 800 years, that led to all the religious conflict and hatred that's gone on. The Jerusalem, a bloodbath to our knees. 4th Crusade, when the Crusaders came through Constantinople, slaughtered 100,000 Greek Orthodox. So that led to the permanent enmity between those two. 1215, by the Lateran Council, that's a church in Rome. Any of you know the Church of St. John the Lateran? They had a conference in 1214, and that officially institutionalized the ghetto. The Jews, don't kill them, keep them around, but make them suffer. Stick them in a ghetto, turn them over to their rabbis, and the rabbis really dominated life in the ghetto. And if the masses go a little bit, Jews could get out at 9 in the morning, had to be back by 4 in the afternoon. They couldn't do anything except lend money. They were the pariahs, but we want them around. They wear funny hats, they wear funny clothes. Hitler didn't invent the Jewish badge. The Jewish badge, the gold star, the yellow star, was invented here in the Fourth Lateran Council, the Council of Rome, the ghetto, dress code, economic isolation. But pray for them. Pray for them and hope, as we expect, they will all convert. And there were a lot of conversions, many, many conversions in this period. Some Jews just snuck out. Young kids would leave the ghetto, run out, and say, that's it, I'm going to have it, and become lost completely. But pray for the conversion. The Jew, this is where the Jew gets the new role. The Jew is an accentuated role. The Jew is the Christ killer. Christian blood, as I said last time, used for the making of matzah. Cursed is the wandering Jew. Every time a Jew saw a statue of Christ, a crucifix, the Jew was forced to wander. That was Christ's punishment, the wandering Jew. How is that exacerbated? By driving them out. If you drove the Jew out, the Jew became a wandering Jew. They couldn't stay any place for long because they were driven out. The arrival of this other group of people, it was just amazing to me that not many of you knew about the Gypsies. They're called Roma. And today, how many of you have traveled through Eastern Europe? Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Russia, although, and any of you get a sort of come up to by panhandlers in Paris or any of the cities of Europe, a lady carrying a little baby, they are Roma. These are Gypsies. They are Indo-European. What do I mean by Indo-European? They are not Arab, they're not Berber, they're not Moorish. They belong to a group of people who wandered out of India in the 13th and 14th century into Europe, speaking an Indo-European language, and they became identified also with the Jews as somehow involved with Christ's martyrdom on the cross. The Jews killed Christ. What did the Gypsy do? And what is the Gypsy stereotype? What are Gypsies all called by people just who want to stereotype them? The Jews killed Christ. What did the Gypsies do? They stole his robe, because all Gypsies are thieves. Even in Israel, there is a Romanian Romanian kibbutz, and they tell jokes about it. They say, recipe for a Romanian omelet: steal 2 eggs. The first thing you do if you're Romanian is you steal 2 eggs, because all Romanians are somehow blemished by being overwhelmingly having a lot of Roma, a lot of Gypsies there. 1348, that really nailed it for Jews and for Muslims. 1348, the Black Death came, and why? For those of you who are public health majors or know something about public health, why do you think the Jews, and there were hardly any Muslims in Europe, but why did the Jews and the Muslims die at a slower rate than Christians? Ritual washing. Just the act of Muslims washing 5 times a day, Jews washing 3 times a day. They pray 3 times a day. Just that act. And the Jews, if the Jews died at a slower rate, they were in trouble. Because the Jews were blamed for poisoning the wells, for stealing children, for doing all sorts of things. So the Black Death, and Europe was decimated by the Black Plague. Astonishing. Bubonic plague, rat plague coming from the east. It was just really amazing. Now, stereotypes. This is the period when stereotypes really get created. For the English majors here, where of Chaucer do you get the stereotype of the Jew? In the Canterbury Tales, one yell out gets you an automatic A. Where in Chaucer do you find the stereotyped Jew, which is the most anti-Jewish of the tales? Okay, take Chaucer, go. Major, find a course in Chaucer. You should all know who Chaucer is. Geoffrey Chaucer, 14th century, great English writer, and read The Prioress Tale. The Prioress Tale is the one where there's the stereotyped Jew. What about Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe? Any of you see Shakespeare in Love? The movie? He had a walk-on role. You know, he's played by Rupert Everett, I believe, and he got no credit for that. But Kit Marlowe was a great contemporary of Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and wrote a play called, anybody take any Elizabethan drama in this class? The Jew of Malta. Thank you. See me after class. The Jew of Malta. So you get stereotypes. And then where do you get, because Shakespeare was so great a writer, he couldn't quite bring himself to do the total stereotype. He did an ambiguous Jew and did an ambiguous play and gave the Jew compassion, humanity, made him a Jew, and there are a lot of Jewish characteristics about him. He's a moneylender, and he's going to punish the Jew, but it's a great play. The Merchant of Venice. right? What is the price that he has to pay? What is the price that Shakespeare makes the Shylock, we use the word Shylock today, a moneylender, you call somebody's a Shylock, you don't know that what you're using the term, but a Shylock is a nasty term. What was the price that Shylock had to pay in the Merchant of Venice? If you don't convert, you're going to lose your daughter, and he does lose his daughter. What's the famous line, the soliloquy that Shylock says that, that gives the humanity, where people then look at Shylock and say, maybe we're not doing this quite right with the Jews. There's a great soliloquy he makes. Do I not, what am I? Am I not human? Do I not feel pain? Do I not bleed? Do I not weep? And Shylock comes across as a regular human being, and Shakespeare's characterization of him. So you get a chance tonight, go home, read the Prioress Tale, get the Jew of Malta out, and take a look at the Merchant of Venice. These guys never even saw a Jew, because the Jews were banned from England by 1190. So it was their stereotype, the idea of what do you think the Jew is like? Chaucer never saw probably a Jew, or maybe he saw a Spanish-Jewish wine merchant, a sherry salesman at best. But the Jews were gone from England already. Marlowe in the 15th, 16th century, he didn't see it. Shakespeare might never have seen a Jew either. So they weren't. They were gone from the British Isles, right? So these were the stereotypes. Now, why did the Jew pay a big price? Why did anybody pay a big price? Because they were deflecting. The Crusades failed. The 9 Crusades were for Christianity a disaster. And after 1291, the failed Crusades, Islam takes a look at where Christianity retreats. The Christian armies, the Knights Templar, they all say we got to get out of here, and they start retreating back into Europe. Who's following them? The Muslim armies are following them. Really, the Ottoman army is following them. And eventually, they reach Constantinople and conquer Constantinople in 1453. It's the end of the Eastern Christian Empire. This empire is all going to go as the Muslim armies follow Christianity up. They get here and they take it all over. Constantinople falls, 1453. Islam is once again in Europe. They get driven out of the Iberian Peninsula. Islam is driven out in 1492. All the Muslim armies are out of Spain. Christianity is gone. But they come right back through the east, and they stay in Europe for a long time. Islam again. They get to the gates of Vienna. Some of you have been to Vienna. Think when you look out your window in your hotel in Vienna and look east, up till 1580, all of that was under the control of Islam. Think, what does that mean? Which parts? All of what we call today the Balkans, all of what we call today Hungary, all of what we call today Romania, Bulgaria, all of that was under the control of Islam. And so Islam got up there and stayed in Europe for a long time. Well, how long did Islam stay in Europe? 1580, they get to the gates of Vienna. How long did Islam stay in Vienna? It started getting pushed back in the 18th and 19th century, but when did Islam, as a European power, leave Europe? When were they finally out? What got them out? World War I. At the Treaty of Versailles, Islam loses all of its European power and are driven out. And out they go. Now, who is left behind? You're in power for 400 or 500 years in Europe. You're going to leave a lot of converts. Where are the European Muslims who look like the vast majority of the white folks here? They're European like you are, Indo-European, European. Where are they? I'd love to say that Turkey is part of Europe, but that hasn't happened yet. Part of it is, but the Turks are ethnically still a little bit different than the vast majority. They don't speak an Indo-European language. So they don't speak an Indo-European language, and you can say there are plenty of Indo-Europeans in Turkey, but it's not yet what you would call a European country. But what part of Europe left the vast, and besides, Turkey was overwhelmingly Muslim earlier on, much earlier on. They weren't converted to Islam by the Ottoman Empire. They were the Ottoman Empire, right? They were the Ottoman Empire. So where do we find Muslims today in Europe? But those are immigrants from late. They're late. The French Muslims and the rest of the European Muslims are late coming, recently arrivals, last 50 years. In the Balkans. They're in the Balkans. And which country? Not in Serbia, not in Croatia, in Bosnia and in Albania. There you have the vestige of the European Muslims who were converted by Ottoman Empire and are still there. They still get, they get really beaten up on. That's really an interesting struggle. Now, the spread of the Black Plague, this bubonic plague from 1348 to 1360, you have no idea what part of the European population was destroyed. They were dead. They were killed. They were being brutalized. I mean, they were dying by the entire village. 80% in some of the villages died of bubonic plague. You can see the percentages of it and see how it spread when it came in. So the spread of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, was enormous. Yet people were looking, who's at fault? Could it be, would Jesus permit this? Well, Jesus doesn't have control because you know why? The Jews still haven't converted yet. So everything could get blamed on the Jews, and they were still there because they were now in ghettos, and the Jews, and they were dying at a slower rate. I mean, the medieval Jew is a moneylender. The demonization of the Jew. Excuse me, I got to hold it. Where do you get the stereotype here? The nose. Look at the nose, the hooked nose. And then what are they doing? They're lending money to poor, innocent Christians who are getting screwed here by this Jew with the funny-looking hat and the funny-looking shoes. So the Jews were dressing differently, looking differently, and they were different, and all they were doing was lending money. So they were demonized, they were stereotyped, and that lasted all through this period of the Jewish Dark Ages. But it's the Dark Ages for everybody. I mean, this was a period when 70% of the children under the age of 4 never saw 5. This is a Europe that is being destroyed by disease, plague, famine. I mean, what do we call this period sometimes? For those of art, literature, culture, painting, what is the period that we discuss when we talk about art, literature, painting, the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Masaccio, Giotto? The Renaissance! If you're a Renaissance prince, wonderful. If you're a Renaissance prince, it's great. Like in the Decameron, you can go and find a healthy place to live. Get away from the city. Get away from the plague. In fact, both Chaucer and Boccaccio dealt with people running away from the plague. Well, the other people stayed and died. I mean, 75% of the people, kids, never reached 5. They died by 4. So people were dying all over the place, and the Jew was a perfect stereotype, the perfect reason why people would die in this thing. The wandering Jew. The idea, if you saw a crucifix or you saw a picture, any crucifix, the Jew automatically had to get up and go. Well, they were also being driven out, but you got to get up and go. Somebody wrote me an email asking me about the position of the popes vis-a-vis the driving out of the Jews. Each pope had a different position. The popes could, say, one pope would say the Jews are at fault, another pope said, leave them alone. Others would say, 3 or 4 of the popes were Jews. Anacletus II was, his mother and father were the Pierre Leones. They were Jews, and they converted early on. They became Christians. Later, he was declared an anti-pope, but still he was a pope for a while in Rome, and there were 2 or 3 of those guys hanging around. So the popes themselves could go back and forth. The people got violent from time to time. That's when they gathered all the Jews in the Lincoln, in the York Cathedral and burned them all to death in England. And they were great acts of real violence. Not anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness. If you wanted to get out, what did you have to do? All you had to do to get saved was what? Convert. You could pray for the conversion of the Jew. That's all they cared about. Now, the Jews, meanwhile, the Jews are getting driven out now. The people are rioting. It was 1290 in England. Then the Jews are also burned a lot, many of them. 1394 driven out of France. 1492 driven out of Spain. And where do they go? They wander east. By this time, the lingua franca of the Jews had been taken over by the language that the Jews spoke and wrote in Germany. So the common language of the Jews in England, France, Germany became Yiddish, Judendeutsch. It became a common denominator. This funny language that was 85, 90% German, but written with the Hebrew letters and read from right to left, that became the language of all of these Jews as they left their countries. They left England, they left France. There was no Germany yet. There were about 300 different German duchies and principalities. Some of them kept them, some of them didn't keep them. The Jews of Spain went basically here. They went to Byzantium, they went to the Ottoman Empire where they were welcome. They were still the people of the book for Islam. The Muslims did not do to the Jews what the Christians did to the Jews in this phase. So the Jews settled here in North Africa. The other ones that are leaving now, they settled here in southern Italy. They settled here in Greece. They settled in the Balkans. But the vast majority of Jews from northern Europe and out went eastward. And they took with them their Yiddish. Their Ladino went down here, but their Yiddish went where? In what we would call today Poland and Russia. That's where Yiddish finally moved. After the 14th century, the expulsion and the Jewish Dark Ages. This was a bad time. Some of the Jews stayed behind in the ghettos and survived here in Germany, but the other majority. Now, what's going on with Christianity? It's, from Satan to since we first encountered Satan in the book of Job, we've been wondering who this guy is. What is Satan? Then finally, even in the Christian Bible, Jesus has to wrestle with Satan in the desert. So the individual who is kind of the countervailing, the force against good, the force for evil, has its place in Judaism, has its place in Christianity, and Satan is what, as I said, Osama bin Laden called George W. Bush after 9/11. He said this man is Satan. So it's a tradition that exists in all three of these religions. You find it in the Christian Bible, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will lead many astray. And that's what the Antichrist, what Satan does. It's the power that leads astray. You think it's the good guy and it's the bad guy. For nation will rise against nation, and there shall be famine and earthquakes. So when the Antichrist comes, what are you going to have? Big time apocalypse. Well, that's also going to happen when Christ comes. So you don't know. I mean, this is a paranoid's paradise. You don't know who you're talking to. Am I talking to Christ, or am I talking to the Antichrist? They all look alike, and that's one of the paradigms of it. But in Matthew, they say, watch out. In Mark, false messiahs and false prophets will appear, produce signs and omens to lead astray. So as Christianity looked through this period of the Black Plague, the Lost Crusades, everything was going wrong. Everything was going wrong for all three religions, actually. For the Jews in the in the ghetto, it was bad news. The rabbis were trying to control them, but it was a period where everybody was looking for heretics. You're looking for reasons why things aren't going well. And things aren't going to go well. You got to find a reason why things aren't going well. Whose side is God on? Who is the real God? How do I recognize him? The people themselves, the ones who were dying, were desperate. And what would the organized religion? Religion had become organized. When Christ didn't return, as Paul promised, what happened? You get the institution of religions. For Jews, it was whatever the rabbis wrote and said. For Christianity, whatever the church fathers wrote and said. You look for heresies, you look for heretics, you look for people who need to be burned at the cross, you look for witches. Witches. What sects are usually witches? What sex? It's women. Women are witches. Men, I bet you don't even know the name for a male witch. A warlock. They're warlocks, but witches are the ones you really want to burn. Even at Salem, of the 19 people that were burned, were hanged, I think 16 were women. They only got 3 men. So whose side is God on? You know, defeating the Holy Land, the Crusades failed. They failed, 1291. They're all back, and they're saying what? Whose fault is it? It must be, because they don't have any Muslims around, it must be the Jews. The plague, it must be the Jews. Triumphant advance of Islam in Eastern Europe, they're up the gates of Vienna. They're up there with their armies, so they're bad enough. The Jews didn't do that, maybe. Then corruption of the Holy Church. And this is something that's you got to deal with. If you read the official history of the Vatican, it's called the Liber Pontificalis. And it's a very, very good history of the Vatican Church. You discover that so many of the popes were corrupt. There were illegitimate children running all over the Vatican. You got Borgias, you got Medici, you got people who became priests at the age of 12 or 11. You get selling it was how do you get into heaven? Indulgences. You can buy your way into heaven. And this was where the poor people got really snookered and suckered. I mean, the Vatican, the Holy Church, the institution of the Catholic Church, you got occasionally wonderful popes, but for the most part, it was corrupt in this period of time, and they write about it. So where is the triumphant Christ? Why hasn't he come? He didn't show up in 1,000. He didn't show up when Paul said he was going to show up. He didn't show up in 1,000. Where is he? What's going on? How do I seek salvation? And they started saying there's got to be another way. The priests aren't helping. The rabbis aren't helping. The mullahs aren't helping. Nobody's helping. So you look, does God have a rival? That's the Antichrist. Is there an Antichrist? Who is he? And how do I find my own salvation? Christianity is seeking a savior. They're looking for somebody who can come and settle it all and straighten all of this mess out. And some of the artists, some of the paintings actually did it. Now, we talked about it. This is not Michelangelo. This is not Leonardo. They're painting great pictures of the Madonna. They're painting pictures of the Pietà, Christ coming down from the cross, the Madonna and Child, the Annunciation. But here is Luca Signorelli, The Deeds of the Antichrist. These are all in Orvieto. If you ever get a chance to anybody been to Orvieto? Great, great place to go look. But here's a picture of Christ preaching to the masses. Looks like Jesus preaching to the masses until we get closer. And it turns out that it's not Christ. We got to look at that guy's face and look at this guy whispering into his ears. Look at that face. That's not a face of Jesus. That's a face of the Antichrist. And who's that whispering into his ear? The devil. So and what are they doing? They're screwing around with these people. They're saying, follow me, follow me. If you go online now and you just Google Antichrist, I think the number is 73 million different sites that you're going to find. Because the Antichrist right now is a big deal. We are in this apocalyptic moment, and the Antichrist is a huge deal right now. But the Luca Signorelli Orvieto frescoes are great because you get this great, scary face with the devil talking to him. Now, people had to go in there, they had to find another way. The priests weren't helping, the Vatican wasn't helping, even the rabbis in the ghetto weren't helping. People were looking for a new way. And it began when we start seeing the age of what basically is mysticism. Any of you into the Kabbalah? Woo! Besides Madonna and a few other people? You into the Kabbalah? Yeah. The Kabbalah is what? And that's part of this. It's finding your own path to God. What don't you need? You don't need to follow rules. You don't have to do incense. You don't have to light the candles the way you're told. You don't have to go and do the praying the way you do it. You don't have to kneel this way. You don't have to kneel that way. You don't have to follow 613 commandments. You don't have to do anything. Don't have to follow what the mullahs are telling me to do. You can find your own individual way. The Jews were the first to decide we need our own path. And around 1250, there's a book that's called in Hebrew, the Zohar. It was written in Ladino, written in Judeo-Spanish, and in the Judeo-Spanish, I put the Roman letters down. It's called El Libro de Splendor, the Book of Splendor. Woo! And the Book of Splendor is really one of those woo moments. It is really, it is unique. It's into things that are unique and secret to individual people, your own individual pathway. For instance, Numbers are hugely important in the Zohar. Numbers. You can find your path to God if you know the right combination. If you know the right combination. It's what led my mother to be a really congenital gambler. I mean, my mother would look at a policeman's badge and say, that's it. And then she went and played that number for the next 30 years. I had a secretary once who bet every day the birthdays of her grandchildren. And she knew she couldn't stop. She never will stop. Why won't she stop? Because she knows on the day she stops, she's going to win. And she won't have it. So they're hooked, and numbers can do this. But it began, this tradition of numerology began actually in the book of Revelation, and then the Jews picked it up again in the 13th century with the El Libro de Esplendor, the whole idea of numerology. What are some of the what's a lucky number? 7's a lucky number, so numbers are important. 7, 2 trinities, and a unity. You come up with special numbers, special numerals. Well, there's bad numbers too. So there's no good numbers, there's bad numbers, and the Zohar gives you pathways to find the God. Out of that emerged God's secret numerology and the whole sum total of Jewish mysticism, though there is a word that's called Kabbalah. You can spell it 2 different ways, but the Kabbalah is the sum total of Jewish mysticism. How do you find your own unique individual pathway to God? In Christianity was the monastic orders, the hermit. I don't want to be around anybody else. I'm going to go off in the desert alone and find God, and God will start talking to me. And that's what emerges. Individual conversations with God without the intermediaries, without priests, without rabbis, without mullahs or imams. You do it on your own. In Islam, it's called Sufism. The Sufis have found their own individual pathway. We know very little about it, but I just threw it in because we know so little bit about Sufism in Islam. But hearing the voice of God became extraordinarily important. The trouble is, you don't know who's talking to you. It could be God, or it could be Satan, the devil, or the worst yet, the anti-God, the anti-Christ. So here you get the situation of poor Joan of Arc, illiterate young French girl, born in 1412, burned at the stake at how old? At the age of 19. She saves France. She gives France her whole, it's 100 Years' War. Joan of Arc does this remarkable thing, and she said, why did she do it all? Why did she do it? Why did Joan take head of the armies, go to the Dauphin, and said, I got to lead France to victory? And he said, who told you to do this? And she said, God. I think it was St. Michael. St. Michael told me to do this. And the Dauphin, who was a bit of a boob, said, well, okay, let's go. And off she went and conquered the British army. British conquered her, captured her, and what'd they do? They burned her at the stake, and then what happens? In 1920 comes the great whoops moment. Whoops. We made a mistake, and she is now St. Joan. So St. Joan has been sanctified, forgiven, made a mistake, we did it, and so the Inquisition got her. The Inquisition was started in France, went to Spain, went all over Europe to find heresy. How do I find heretics who are defiling the work of God? In literature, and I go back to it every once in a while, you got 2 great examples of magic. You got the Faust legend. The Faust legend. What is the Faust legend? There is a German, a professor, a student, a scholar, who says, all I want to know is what? I want to know everything. I want to know everything. And all of a sudden, some guy in red socks appears. He says, hi, I can do that for you. I can give you everything and all the knowledge in the world. All you have to do is give me your life. I'm going to get anyway. But what's more important than your life? Your immortal soul. And Faust says what? And so we got this phrase, he made a Faustian pact. A Faustian pact. He made a pact. It became a legend that runs through literature. And if you see the movie Damn Yankees, old movie, 1953, I think, Damn Yankees, it was based on a Douglas Wallop novel called The Year the Yankees Lost the Pennant. The Washington Senators had no hope of ever winning the American League in the 1950s. They were a pathetic, miserable, wretched team. The Yankees dominated. And this guy, Douglas Wallop, wrote a book called The Year the Yankees Lost the Pennant. How is it that the Yankees lost the pennant? Who saw it happen? Who made it happen? Devil. There was this old Washington Senators fan said, I'd give my soul if the Yankees would lose and Washington would win. And poof, all of a sudden there's a guy there with Red Sox and said, hi, my name is Mr. Applegate. Can I help you? And in this funny novel, which became a good musical comedy on Broadway with Gwen Verdon playing a very nice role, the old man becomes a young man, does it all. It's a good movie. Go. It costs you less than $1, I'm sure, to rent, or you get it for free online. But it's where else does the Faust theme appear? We also talk about Marlowe wrote a Dr. Faustus play, but where else? Anybody do opera? Gounod's Faust? The Faust legend is a powerful legend running through all of European Western literature. The man who is willing, usually it's a man, the man who is willing to sell his soul to the devil for something, sex, whatever. But in Faust's case, it was total knowledge. At the end, he gets lucky and he gets saved. At least in Goethe's version, he gets saved. So, I mean, all of these are the Faust. What about Shakespeare's Tempest? There's bad magic, which is called, given the color black magic, and then there's white magic. I mean, it was an age where people believed in magic. If Shakespeare could write a play called A Midsummer Night's Dream and write about what? What's going on in the forest? A whole bunch of fairies running around. And the people believed it. They believed in fairies. They believed in goblins. They believed in ghosts. They believed that Hamlet's father could return. The Elizabethans believed all of this stuff. So why not? So Shakespeare wrote a play called The Tempest about not a dark magician, but a white magic. His name is? Anybody read The Tempest? Come on. Prospero. He's a good musician, a good magician, a good guy, comes out and Shakespeare gives him a break and wins it all. But there are also false messiahs appearing all over Europe. Christian messiahs again, Jewish messiahs, Muslim messiahs. The most interesting one, I just picked out one, in the 17th century, a false messiah, a Jew named Shabbatai Tzvi. He was born in Smyrna in Turkey and said, he was a charismatic, powerful speaker, and as a young man at 21 said, God has spoken to me and told me I am the Messiah. He got a lot of followers. Thousands and thousands of people followed him everywhere. They went to Egypt. There he married an Egyptian prostitute because God told him, you have to sink down before you will rise up. He sunk down, and then he rose up. And then he said, I'm going to be in Istanbul. I'll be in Constantinople. And there, the Caliph, now Istanbul, the Caliph will embrace me, and everybody will convert to Judaism. And so the Jews were really convinced that this guy was going to bring all three of these religions together. He goes on a big pilgrimage, thousands. By the time he got to Istanbul, there were 100,000 followers along with him. He goes to appear before the Caliph. The Caliph let him in and said to him, what is it you want? He says, you're going to convert to Judaism. The Caliph said, if by tomorrow you don't become a Muslim, I'm cutting your head off. Shabbatai Tzvi thought about that for about 15 minutes and said, Allah, I'm all yours. Converted, shocked his followers, destroyed the whole movement, and he was the last and most prominent of the Jewish false messiahs, this 17th century one who came along. So who spoke? Christ or Antichrist? It's that people are looking, where do we find the person who's going to help us? And finally in Germany, it appeared. Now, this is a slight digression to technology, because technology now plays a major role. Here we have, before 1450, this is a beautifully illuminated, this is what illuminated manuscripts looked like. There are 100,000 illuminated manuscripts in, where's my little light here? How come I don't have my lights on? interesting. Oh, there it is. 100,000 illuminated manuscripts in Europe. How do these get done? In libraries? How are they done? Who does them? Monks. There were a lot of, they were Jews who did this also, illuminated Jewish Bibles that were kept in special collections, in libraries all over. In Islam, they had learned to illuminate beautifully the Quran, and so you had gorgeous books. The overwhelming number of them were from the Hebrew and the Christian Bible. Like, yeah, this is just gorgeous stuff. 100,000 illuminated manuscripts, all done by hand. In 1450, by 1534, you got 9 million books in Europe. That's less than 100 years, not from 100,000 manuscripts to 9 million books with one technology. Johannes Gutenberg and movable type. A printed Bible. Here's the Bible, the Biblia, and not only that, but this is, let me see, Biblia, das ist, die Schritt, I can't read it myself too well. Mark, published Nuremberg. What language is this? Biblia, das ist die ganze Schrift, ganze Heilige Schrift. It's German. So the Bible by 1534 is 9 million books and translated into what they call the vulgar languages. No longer Latin. If you were caught doing this, you got burned at the stake because the church did not want Bibles published in any language except the language that only the priesthood could read. And that would be either Latin or Greek. In Islam, it was the same way. In Judaism, translating Bibles was out of the question. But the Christians had dominated. And here's the guy who comes along. And this now becomes one of the astonishing events of as we come out of the late Middle Ages into the High Renaissance. Martin Luther. Is he the Savior or is he the Antichrist? I sent you a website from the New Advent Library, the Catholic website. Maybe I haven't sent it yet. I'm going to send it soon. The Catholic version of Martin Luther. Well, how do you think it's going to come out? Not very good. This Martin Luther, is he the Savior? Is a great painting by Lucas Cranach, again, one of the great German 16th century painters. Martin Luther, he is a course. In fact, we do teach a course on Luther. Dan Brown, the German department, and I'm sure the religion department teaches a course on Luther. His dates, 1483 to 1546. The Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation. Faith demonized. You had the schism. The first schism of the Catholic Church between East and West was bad and bloody. There was nothing like the horror, hatred, brutality, and butchery that is associated in the struggle between Protestantism and Catholicism. That when the second great schism took place, these people hated each other with such an intensity that was beyond belief. 1455, the Gutenberg Bible, the simple idea of movable type. It wouldn't have happened without movable type. It wouldn't have happened without movable type for one interesting year. 1508, Martin Luther becomes a priest and joins an order, the Augustinian order. These orders are interesting. What is Cardinal O'Malley? Cardinal O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston, the cardinal. He's a cardinal of the church. He runs around in a brown schmata with sandals. What is he? What order? He's a Franciscan. He takes, and what is the Franciscan? St. Francis of Assisi. How many of you have been to Assisi? A few of you have been to Assisi. What is the basic tenet of the order of St. Francis? They all take a vow of poverty. It's poverty. So Father O'Malley dresses around. He looks poor. He got that with that little bandana around his thing and his sandals, no socks, no nothing. In the wintertime, whoo! At 1508, Luther was an Augustinian. From St. Augustine, he becomes an Augustinian monk. Luther was a Catholic, but he was a German without much of a sense of humor. And things happened. In 1510, he took a trip to Rome. He got on a donkey, went through those high alpine passes. How many of you have been to Talwar? If you've been to Talwar, Talwar is one of those low alpine passes where you can get back and forth almost all winter long. And that's the way the monks went from Northern Europe to Southern Europe. Anybody who went on a pilgrimage to Rome got there. They went through the Brenner Pass, they went through the Gotthard Pass, they went through the Alpine Pass where Annecy is, and you could get to Europe that way. Well, what did he see in 1510 when he went to Europe? Debauchery, corruption, illegitimacy, venality, filth, money. He was disgusted with what he saw, came back, and he stewed and brewed, and finally in 1517, he wrote down 95 complaints against the Catholic Church and did what it was the university bulletin board. There was no Tufts Daily. There was no place to hang notices online. So you posted your complaints and your notices on the door of the university church. He was a professor at Wittenberg, and he nailed his complaints up on the door of the church. Everybody. There were a lot of pieces of paper up there, and his went up there with the rest. 95 reasons why the Pope is a schlemiel, why he's a loser, and why we should stop following Rome. Within 3 days, normally, what happens to notices up on bulletin boards like that? They fall off, they blow apart. One of Luther's students took the notice off the bulletin board after 3 days and took it to the local printer and ran off a couple of 100 copies. Somebody else got one and then took his printer and ran off a couple hundred more copies. Before a year was out, there were thousands of these complaints against the Catholic Church and against the Pope. In 1517, what was the date that he nailed them up? Is there a Lutheran in the group? Do we have a Lutheran here who should know the date of what is called Reformation Day? It's also the name of the 5th Mendelssohn Symphony, the Reformation Symphony. What's Reformation Day? I may put this on the exam. What's Reformation Day? We don't have one lousy Lutheran in the whole class? October, have I got it up there? Oh yeah, October 31st, 1517. That's Reformation Day, right? Now, who are the popes at this time? Go online, go Google, and read about, and the safest place is probably Wikipedia. Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, he was a Borgia. His niece, Lucrezia Borgia, was living in the Vatican with her husband and illegitimate children. The Pope was shacked up with 3 or 4 different mistresses. These were Renaissance princes. What were their greatest accomplishments? Art. These were Renaissance princes. Art, culture, civilization, literature. That's what they do. What were they not so good at? Getting close to God. That wasn't their strength. Alexander VI was also the guy who burned Savonarola in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. How many of you have been to Florence? A lot more have been to Florence. That's where it was Alexander VI who did that to Savonarola, the Borgia Pope. 1503 to 1513, Julius II. He didn't become a priest until he was about 40. I don't know if he ever did become a priest, but he was a general. He was the one in, what was the movie with Carlton Heston and the novel from Irving Stone? What was the name of that movie? Now, the older people should remember it. No. The one he plays Michelangelo in the movie. What is it that this guy says? He was a great general, but also a great patron of art. He says, you're going to do this. The wall of the Sistine Chapel is falling apart, and you got to do. He says, I don't want to. I'm not a painter. And Michelangelo says, I don't want to do this. Julius II says, you'll do it. And then he goes off to fight more armies, fight more wars. And when he comes back, the Sistine Chapel is done. And that was it. It was Julius II, who was a general, a military guy. He didn't give a damn about the Vatican. He cared about 2 things, winning wars and his chapel. Any of you visited the Sistine Chapel? That was all done by Julius II, done by Michelangelo. And the third of them during Luther's watch was Leo X, the Medici Pope from 1513 to 1521. Leo X was as debauched as they come. You could buy an annulment for 15 cents. I mean, everybody was getting annulled. It was one of the great moments of church debauchery. These three popes, they were a league. So who is the King of England at the time when Leo is the Pope? Who's the King of England at the time? Talk about figures in history. Who's the King of England? Henry VIII. So Henry VIII, he marries the Queen of Spain, and she doesn't produce any women, any boy or heirs. He desperately wants an heir. He's married through a whole bunch of years. He says, don't worry, I'll get this one annulled. Look who's sitting in the throne, who's Peter's throne. Leo X, he's shacked up with everybody in town. I'll just go down and say, annul my marriage. He goes down, and what does Leo say? No! Leo says no. And Henry VIII goes bananas. And what does he eventually do? Pulls away from the Vatican, winds up executing, killing a couple of different cardinals who say you can't do this, Thomas à Becket and a few other people. And what does he do? He says, you know what I'm going to do, Leo? I'm making my own church. It's going to be called the Church of England. Screw you, buddy. And Henry VIII goes out and creates the Church of England. For those of you who are church, it's a very high church. It's almost identical with Catholicism. But it's different because who is the Pope of the Church of England? The Archbishop of Canterbury. So that's politics and church. And then the last thing we want to talk about, 1618, 1648, in connection with this was the ultimate war of butchery, the 30 Years' War. That is the war you know the least about, that's important in your lives. Here's just a cover of Peter Wilson's book called Europe's Tragedy. That's what he entitled it. Europe's Tragedy, A History of the 30 Years' War. 1618, you know how long it lasted? It's called the 30 Years' War. It went from 1618 to 1648. That's 100 years after Luther's manifesto. What Luther did, for 100 years, Europe sort of staggered back and forth, deciding what Protestantism got its feet firmly on the ground. The Reformation took place, and for 100 years they had battled each other on a small scale, but in 1618, Europe decided, now we're going to have it out really. And they decided they're going to have the first great, enormous war, religious war of slaughter and butchery. And that was the 30 Years' War. Christians killing Christians. Right now what's going on with the three religions of Abraham. Who's killing whom mostly? Mostly. Muslims are mostly killing Muslims. The Sunni and the Shia are killing each other all through the Middle East, killing in Iraq. We get some Christians, some Westerners get killed. They behead somebody, but it's for the most part, 90% of the killing that's going on is Muslims killing Muslims. Christians are no longer killing Christians. Jews only individually kill each other when they get really But this was the first great war of religious butchery. I show you this is from C.V. Wedgwood's 30 Years' War, this picture. There's a priest. What's the priest doing? Blessing who? Who's he blessing? The people who have just been hanged. You're dead now, but at least I'll bless you and you'll become a Catholic in your death, right? This is a nice small picture. Here's the larger picture. This is what happened regularly. In the name of God, these were called hanging trees. You got every male from every Protestant army went into a Catholic town. You found the Catholics, and either you cut off their arms or their legs and floated them down a river, or you got them all underneath a variety of trees and hanged all the men. And you blessed them. You also, this is a larger picture. This is the priest going up on the ladder, blessing all these people that he's hanged. Any of you read Brecht's Mother Courage? Mother Courage is Brecht's great contribution to the literature of the 30 Years' War. Great play, and a play of total butchery. And that's all they did. Protestant armies would go into Catholic towns. Catholic armies went into Protestant towns, cut off all the arms and legs of all the Catholic men, floated them down the river, or hanged everybody from hanging trees. So it was the first Great War. Also, an upgrade in armaments so you could kill larger and larger numbers of people. How many died in this war, which was fought all over Europe, from Poland to France? It was fought. It was fought all over Europe for the most part. How many people died? Percentages of people died over 50%, 40%, 30%. It was a war of consummate brutality that lasted on and off, not just constantly, but on and off for 30 years. Christian chaos. You know, the Protestant Reformation broke the Protestant church away, Lutheranism, away from the Catholic Church. What then did the Protestants do? What then did happen to Protestantism? There are now worldwide 9,000 different Protestant denominations. There are over 1,000 in the United States. So Protestantism did what? Some of you are mainstream Protestant. What's mainstream? Mainstream would be, you could name me 5 or 6 of the larger Protestant churches in the United States that are considered mainstream. Baptist, big in the South, not bad in the Midwest either. Episcopalian, high church, close to the Church of England, elegant, William and Mary. Methodist, big time in the United States. They came in the 18th century. Tufts is what? What were we founded as? Universalist, Unitarian. First Universalist, then we moved in with the University. So all these churches, Presbyterian, and then there are 15 Presbyterian churches. There are 30 Lutheran churches. They splintered for whatever reason. All these churches got divided. And you wind up with total Christian chaos. And what did they do with each other? They learned, as in Freud's narcissism of minor difference, each one learned to hate the other. They learned to hate Catholicism first, then they learned to hate each other. Some of the Christians couldn't stand it anymore in Europe, and they sought religious refuge somewhere else. Some Christians sought refuge from religious persecution in new lands. They were called pilgrims. They landed in 1618. They left England. They were Protestant dissenters. They left England, went to Holland. They saw the war all over. They said, we got to get out of here. They got a little boat, sailed for England, sailed for the new land. They said, the New Jerusalem. We'll find the new Christianity in this new country. They get there, and what do they do as soon as they arrive at Plymouth Rock? What do they do? Look at these wonderful people. What are they doing? There's the boat. What are they doing? They're praying. And so what are they praying? What are they saying? What do you think they're saying at Plymouth Rock? Thank you, God, for giving us this blessing. Within 30 years, they're hanging Quakers on the Boston Common. The religions, the Protestants, this was overwhelmingly a Protestant dissenting country when it was settled in 1620. 1630, Boston gets settled, and by 30 years later, they're hanging Quakers on the Boston Common. There is a monument to Mary Dyer underneath the State House. Go to the Boston Common, and you'll see the monument to this woman, Mary Dyer, walking to her execution, surrounded by several people who are members of the Harvard faculty. And what was her crime? What was her crime? She didn't follow the rules as they were laid out by the Congregationalists. The Congregationalists said, this is how you pray. What did she do? She walked into her church and began quaking. She shook. She says, God, she was so filled with the Spirit of God that she, and all of them were, the Society of Friends, they quaked in the presence of God. And they were called Quakers. But the other Protestants took umbrage at it, so much so that what did they do? Hanged them. Calvinists drowned Baptists on the banks of the Charles River. Baptists became different from Calvinists. Calvinists different from Episcopalians. Every one of them, and they all started their own colleges. Harvard was only for the Congregationalists. Yale was for the Calvinists. Brown was for the Baptists. All religious fanatics. All of those colleges were religious fanatics. William and Mary was founded by the Episcopalians. The evangelical Presbyterians were absolutely certain that Christ would show up in New Jersey, so they left and went down and formed Princeton. So they were all looking for their own thing, and they wanted nothing to do with the parishioners and the churchmen of the other Protestant. Catholics they hated enough, but they hated each other so much that they literally killed each other, right? Where are the Jews amidst this Christian slaughter? Either still in the ghettos or keeping as low a profile as possible, and the rabbis are keeping them under control. They have moved. Majority of them were moved to the Kingdom of Poland and to the Tsardom of Russia, and they've taken their language with them, this Yiddish language with them. Look at the mess that Germany is, the number of different principalities. I mean, it was crazy. Now, when the 30 Years' War is over, 1648, the Christian theocracies, and they were all theocracies. What do I mean by a theocracy? What's a theocracy? A country that is ruled by rule of God. What's a theocracy? I mean, what, can you name one today? What's a theocracy? Give me a couple of countries that are theocracies. Iran is a Shia, they say it's an Islamic Shia state, even though over half the people there are under the age of 25, and the leaders of the state are going to have a tough time doing it. But where else is there a theocracy? Saudi Arabia is probably the most. That is a Wahhabi Sunni theocracy. That's really interesting. Now, so we are not a theocracy because our founding fathers said no. Jefferson said no. On the other hand, before the Revolutionary War, we were a country of God. You could not get into the legislature. We were a theocracy, and we're still trying to figure out what a Christian country is like. The United States is still trying to figure that out, what a Christian country is like. We sort of know what a Muslim country looks like. We now maybe get an idea. Now Turkey, we get an idea what a secular Muslim country looks like. Israel was supposed to be a secular, but secular, what does that mean? Just like secular Turkey. Secular Turkey is where religion doesn't really dominate the state. Israel was supposed to be one where religion doesn't dominate the state. We'll see what Israel looks like in 40, 50 years. We don't know. And what the United States will be like in 40 or 50 years, we're not sure. But Europe is this way, and Europe is this way now. If I mention a country to you, you tell me what religion, because after the 30 Years' War was over, they said, whatever the ruler says, that's the religion. So if I say to you, Austria, 99% of the Austrians are Catholic. If I say to you, Spain, now these people are not going to church much, but their religion is still Catholic. Spain, Catholic. Italy, Catholic. Poland, they go to church. Poles go to church. Catholic, Roman Catholic. They write with the Roman alphabet, not the Russians. The Russians are Russian Orthodox, Eastern European. So the southern part of France, Catholic. They're overwhelmingly Catholic. The southern part of Europe remained Catholic. Denmark, Protestant. Sweden, Protestant. Norway, Protestant. England, Anglican Church of England. Aha, trick question. England, Church of England. Germany. Northern Germany is, Southern Germany is Catholic. And that is in the Constitution. If the president is a Protestant, the prime minister must be a Catholic. If the president is a Catholic, the prime minister must be a Protestant. So the Germans have built it in. Northern Germany, Protestant, Southern Germany, Catholic. Now, Europe in 1683, Islam is at the gates of Vienna still. They've been there for over 100 years, and there is momentary Christian unity. They say to themselves, they didn't say this literally, I made it up. We hate each other, but we hate them more. And then I mention again Freud's narcissism of minor difference. We will put aside our own hatred of each other because we now can find a common enemy that we hate and we want to drive out. So what happens? All of a sudden you got what? Christian Europe unifying to push out Islam, to push out the Muslims. And indeed, they start pushing them back, but they only get them to the Balkans, and then you have to wait till World War I to get them out completely. But nothing is completely forgotten. And this is a war, holy hatred, a book in the library, religious conflict of the 90s. What 90s is he talking about? Not the 1890s, the 1990s. Where is that religious conflict still? Northern Ireland, the last chapter of the 30 Years' War. In Northern Ireland, Protestant Ulster and the Irish Free State, which is Catholic. So they still hate each other. They still go to war. They still will butcher each other. It's calming down a little bit, but we're not really sure. This thing could flare up. Again, the last chapter of the 30 Years' War. Now, in Europe and America, I mean, really, the people have looked at religion now for since the Crusades, for the last 600 years since the end of the Crusade, and said, enough. This is, religion is a loser. So in Europe and America, there is a new faith. The 18th century, it's called the Age of Reason. Who are some of the literary intellectual figures that we associate with the 18th century? In France, Voltaire. In England, less known maybe, Pope, Addison. In Germany, Goethe, Schiller, Lessing, the Age of Reason. And all of these, in America, who's the guy whose Bible is in the Smithsonian, and every reference to a miracle is cut out of the Hebrew and Christian Bible? It's called the Jefferson Bible, because Thomas Jefferson wanted nothing to do with miracles. Nothing. And he said, cut it all out. There is no such thing. So these were 18th century men. Ben Franklin also. The 18th century, the Age of Reason. Two revolutions that shook the world that said religion really is nothing but trouble. The American colonies in France, the Age of the Enlightenment, without institutionalized religion. In America, it's still a battle. We call it what? The battle between church and state. We haven't settled it yet. You know, I mean, you try to teach evolution we said this the first day, evolution in a school system, you have to get a court order, because there are people who say, no, evolution should not be taught in the public school system because it's not the Word of God. You still have the Word of God. There are 300 colleges in the country where you can't teach evolution because there's still 300 church-affiliated faith-based schools. So the 18th century, the French did far worse. The French Revolution, they killed as many clergy as they could. We didn't do that. We just said there's a separation. The French went ballistic. They were so fed up with religion that the French Revolution really did a number. Now, the Jews, there are a couple of million of them hanging around, trying to keep as low a profile as possible. I got 4 minutes. The Jews of Europe in 1750. And here's where we're going to have our Jewish revolution. We've had schisms among Christians. Islam had a schism immediately. The Sunni and the Shia were butchering each other. There aren't enough Jews to kill each other, to kill themselves. So what they had was a different kind of schism. They had an intellectual, mental schism, but it was just as violent in many ways and just as decisive. And it happened in the 18th century. Two revolutions and schism for the Jews. They split between East and West. And it's 3 minutes to go. I don't know how far I should go. The Jews are now settled. There's a considerable population still in Germany and Austria, and the other huge population is now in Lithuania and Russia. They are joined by a common language. What is that language? Yiddish. They're joined by a common language. It has become the language of the ghetto. It's a language without respect. It's a language that never created a literature. It's a language that is just the language of poor, wretched, miserable people, because that's what the Jews were. Their dark ages were still going on. Although in the United States, Washington did what? Washington said, go build a synagogue in Truro. And what did Napoleon Bonaparte do for the Jews? He broke down the ghetto walls. So the two revolutions believed in Jewish emancipation, but they didn't have control at this point, and the Jews were still miserable and wretched people. In the West, there was a path to modernism and assimilation. And that's the one that we're going to start talking about. 248, is that 243? Oh, 2 more minutes. The path to modernism and assimilation, Western Europe. That's Germany, Poland, and, Germany, France, the western part of Europe, but it was started in Germany by this guy. His name was Moses Mendelssohn. He was a figure of the 18th century, and the ghetto walls come down. On Thursday, we'll do the two revolutions, one in the West, and I'll just quickly go through this, one in the West and another in the East. This is the guy who does it in the East. In the East, another path to the path and to Messiah. That's what we do on Thursday. We're almost there. We are 2 more classes away from our literature. Make sure you got your books.